Welcome to Sculpture Vulture. I'm Lucy Branch, a sculptural conservator and author who is endlessly fascinated by public sculpture. I bring you a series of interviews with sculptors and other fascinating people involved in the field that inspires me, and I hope will do the same for you. You can see the photographs that accompany the episode and the show notes at sculpturevulture.co.uk. Hello, Sculpture Vultures. I hope you've all been having a fabulous June so far. It's been quite a busy month for me, doing conservation work for a new exhibition at Tate Modern, which I highly recommend you visit if you're in the area. It's an exhibition for Zanelli Moholy, who is an artist activist who I didn't know a lot about previously. I had come across only one aspect of the artist's work, which was portrait photography. But I was called in to help with their monumental bronze sculpture and had a wonderful surprise because it's fabulous. Uh, Given that Tate doesn't even mention the bronze sculpture in their own press release for the exhibition, I don't think I can be entirely to blame for not knowing about much about this. But the work is actually a joy, really beautiful, figurative, substantial, excellently crafted work, really quite something. Some definitely would like to have some in my sculpture park of my dreams. One of the things that took me by surprise most was just that a photographer had such incredible kind of craft skills, and that's probably a completely naive thing to say, but it's just that I don't associate those two mediums of art very closely. I kind of wouldn't have thought that necessarily you would just be kind of like a Renaissance person that can do everything, but Mulholly really is one of those artists. And if you don't know much about their work, the photography particularly, it has a focus on documenting and celebrating the lives of South African Black, lesbian, gay, trans, queer, and intersex community groups that still face a huge amount of prejudice and violence in South Africa. If you're keen on photography, it's an absolute must. Apart from anything, there's just a vast amount of work. Moholy is really incredibly prolific, and every one of them is a cracking piece. Today, I am bringing you an interview, which is the first I've ever done for a deceased sculptor. I came across the work of Roy Noakes when his wife contacted me a good while ago now and asked me to help with one of her late husband's sculptures. Roy Noakes was a sculptor known mostly, I think, really for his portrait commissions, such as Lord Avon in the House of Parliament, Bernard Miles, the actor, sculptures in the National Portrait Gallery, and many others. But the sculpture I was brought in to help with left figurative. It was like a dot on the horizon. Can much more easily be described as dynamic abstract, I think. His work kind of makes you scratch your head a bit. It's very emotional, but not in a literal sense. There's a quote in the book about Roy, the quote's by Martin Harrison, and he says, Noakes's sculptural language was concerned with transient and likeness, to conveying fleeting appearances and gestures with the greatest economy. Pared down, that is, in the sense of needing to eliminate everything that was extraneous to the inner energy of his forms. He worked, in short, outside all of the mainstream or avant garde cultural orthodoxies of his time, neither a brutalist, a conceptualist, nor involved with the smooth or shiny surfaces that were barriers to expressing the dynamic potential of his materials. Noakes's surfaces were active, not static. He aimed to breathe life into the clay, to break down the distance between the sculpture and the human form it signified, almost as though blood was coursing through its veins. Biddy, Roy's wife, who joins me for the interview today, is one of the most articulate women I've ever come across. She tells Roy's story so well that I just had to capture it. And I'm not actually sure that Roy could have done a better job himself, but relevant to others out there listening, I think, is what she is dealing with at the moment, which is how to handle sculptural legacy like Roy's, where it should go, who the right custodian is, and how to prevent the loss to the history of British sculpture of work which is significant. I began our conversation today by asking Biddy where she met Roy Noakes.
I met Roy at City and Guilds Art School, remembering then it was an art school which was supported by the City Fathers specifically for developing kit skills. So there's stone carving, there was engraving for the mint, there were apprentices came to do a lot of skills, and also life drawing. So I met Roy when he was just starting to do some life drawing, and he'd come from national service, and before national service he had been an apprentice carver with Italians. So he'd been a carver with a big firm called Anselm Odling, where he carved marble, angels for gravestones. So with Italians, very skilled, learning to carve and going to Brixton School of Art for not for art, but for building, to sort of setting out stone. And then he had changed by the time he went into the army, he'd changed his apprenticeship, and he changed his apprenticeship with a carver called Gerald Dedici, and he was a sort of fixer for big academic sculptors. So there were big commissions that had to be carved, they had to be set out, and the sculptors would deliver the models, and Roy and his friend James Butler would then start carving them, and right to the almost to the end when the sculptor would take over.
Quite an unusual background for he was like an East End boy, wasn't he? He wasn't
He
like
was
highly educated in, not that education sort of means that you're not interested in art, but equally you're less likely to be introduced to art.
absolutely. His father, who died when he was 12, painted the white lines down the Commercial Road,
I know them,
which of
yeah.
course is one of the big roads in the East End. And it was in those days when you had a little trolley and you would trolley your thing, a bit like football grounds and do, trolley the white line right the way down the road. And when his father died, his mother brought up then, she had 5 children. Roy's the youngest. His older children all went into apprenticeship. So his next brother went into carpentry, and Roy had to choose, and he obviously really good at making things, and drawing, and so he was apprenticed to a carver, to a firm of carvers. So he comes from a, a, a background which is of apprenticeships. That's what you did, and then you would be a monumental mason, would be the final end of that. So that transition between a mason and thinking that you would like to do sculpture, um, is a really serious break with tradition.
Mm,
Um, and that all came through somebody saying to him, why don't you go and try and do some drawing? Because your carving will be better if you could draw. So that's where he went to City and Guilds, which was the only kind of art school that he could have got into. In those days, you don't go to art school unless you have come from another route,
mhm.
and that you'd come from a school route and been really highly educated.
Yeah, sure.
So you're exactly right. It is unusual.
And so do you think was it at art school that well, the City and Guilds that he began to learn that it wasn't just a practical technical skill. He had more to him than that.
Yes.
His work is very complex, but I wonder at what point that opened up for him.
I think it opened up by meeting people, by being taught. So when he went to Sitting Gills, he was taught by a sculptor called Bernard Sindel, who was very, very interested in Italian art. So Giacomo uh, Manzu
Mhm,
or Medardo Rosso, were two sculptors who were just beginning to have exhibitions in England. Um, and Bernard Sindel was obviously really madly fond of these two Italian sculptors. And of course, that includes Michelangelo and Donatello and all the sort of big Italians, Renaissance sculptors. So he was introduced to sculpture as a medium for drawing and portraiture and life modeling. But strangely enough, what his work was like when he was at Sitting Gills was imaginative. So instead of doing life models, he made big figures which were purely out of his imagination. And that is slightly different. So he could have possibly been thinking of going through a route where you would be doing commissions, which were quite realistic, but clearly he all his work was coming from his head and it was imaginative. So that started him on a road to doing one figurative work, but also learning to draw, learning to model in a traditional way.
mm,
So at art school, he would learn, at Sitting Gills, he would learn how to put an armature up, how to put clay on, how to make a cast, because carving is different. You're pushing away from the mass rather than building up on an armature. And it's fundamental because then you're thinking of putting on rather than taking away. So it's a whole new skill. And then casting and then finding materials that you could cast in.
mm. And so, just for people that don't know Roy's work, um, can you talk just a little bit about his style? Now, obviously, he had a long life, and it didn't remain the same from start to finish. But just if you can introduce people a little bit.
Yeah, he left City and Guilds and he had made some monumental figures. They, some of them, or at least two or three of them, you could almost say were slightly influenced by the fact that the Pompeii figures, the figures were beginning to be recognized as significant, which were the figures where they were pouring in Pompeii. The archaeologists were beginning to pour plaster of Paris down the hollows and finding these figures that had been encased in the dust and the ash from the volcano. And they were significant. And suddenly people saw figures sort of suffering, and in uh, how can I put it, in gestures which were very active. Some of them sort of looking quite tortured as they were caught by the ash. These influenced, I think, influenced Roy and influenced other sculptors, contemporary sculptors that were also modelling at that time. So these big monumental figures, he left City and Guilds, having done a room full of figurative work. And you could say, well, there were Italian
Right.
um, influences. When he moved to Essex, he built a studio with a friend and had space. And suddenly he could make different kinds of figures, and he was having to work out what
Mhm.
sculpture to him was about. And that
Right.
then continued the whole rest of his life. Rather than doing commissions, didn't say he never refused a commission, but his commissions were mainly for portraiture. But his work that he was doing for himself was one imaginative, the surfaces. He was interested in the surfaces and the contours that, for him, I think, made sculpture.
What did he do? What was the process of him working out? Did he go away and sit in his shed, or did he draw?
No, walking and thinking. So, so when you've got an armature, when you're working on an armature, you're restricted because you're restricted by the internal shape that you put up for your armature. So, so if it's figurative, you have got to put up irons. You've got to put up the wood, the irons, the structure inside in order that would hold the clay, which of course is going to flop. It's going to want to flop all the time. So this is my understanding of how he's thinking. Is gradually he's thinking, do I need to concentrate on a silhouette? Because if you think about what is the thing that's before him, is sculpture which relies heavily on a silhouette, and you walk around sculpture in order to see the whole. So if you think of something like Henry Moore, you walk around it, and each time you move 360 degrees, you are seeing a different piece of work, which is really fascinating. The thing that Roy started to think about is, do I want that? Or do I want to concentrate on the internal shapes of a piece of work, and that the external silhouette
Right.
is not the most important thing? And gradually, this took years to sort of begin in his thinking. Gradually, the silhouette became very simple. So by the time we had moved to Cambridge, where he was restricted in terms of space because he was working in the bottom floor of a very big old house. He's restricted in space, and he's also restricted in light. So his restriction in space meant that he
Mm.
couldn't move in or build big armatures. So the work becomes slightly smaller, and it becomes simpler in terms of the silhouette.
Was it a torturous process to get, because this is a quite a complicated philosophy. This is not something that's being done really or explored much in art at that time. Do you th was it torturous? Was it difficult to get out, or did he just, was it a eureka kind of moment where that he reached?
I know, I think it was a very torturous process, and he was looking back at his work and thinking, I haven't got things right in terms of sculptural form. And do I need to start making the external simpler so that people can, when they look at something, two things happen. One is they can stand still, and it's more contemplative. They could just look for a long time. The other thing is when you're standing still, the light is moving. So now he's got the complication that as light falls on a shape, it actually changes. And the more complex the shapes inside the shapes become, the more complex the sculpture becomes, because the light is doing the movement. You are not walking 360 degrees around something. The change in the direction of light is going to do a lot of the work for you, and it's going to strike shapes from different angles. So it appears that it's sort of almost shimmering, so that you get this complexity of light falling on shapes. And I think that took a long time to get more complicated, and it took more time until this exhibition is an example of his last work, where it becomes also almost flatter, and he's modeling onto board, which no armature, so you don't have to put any armature up now. You can work on a wooden board.
Right. What I was wondering is, are these shapes, are they feelings, or are these shapes, where's the sort of anchor point for the shapes that he's making?
Well, I think them one is they're made quickly. So I used to think, oh, he's not working at all, but because he was walking or thinking or drinking in the pub. So it's and talking to people and sort of shutting off and then shutting in again. But they're made with his hands mainly. So he made his own tools. So you would think of modeling tools as quite traditional. So they were based on modeling tools, but he made his own because he wanted his own shapes that he could pull the clay around with. He's also got there, if you look at his work, he's got hand movements and thumbprints. So he's got hand movements and fist movements, and the edge of the hand and the shape round the thumb, that part of the hand is all over his work where he's pushed it. So it's almost like the carving is coming back again, but
Yeah.
instead of having carving tools, you've got your hands and you're making the shapes with your hand because you're thinking, and then he's refining them. So so they pushed in quite quickly, in fact, very quickly. And I always used to think it's a bit like a poet. So sometimes it's
Mm.
quite a short burst of energy that makes the first move, puts the thing in, and then it's refined, but often not changed a lot. Um, just sort of looked again, and refinements happening all the time. But the main burst of it is quick.
Do you think there was one he was most proud of? One he would have liked to have been remembered for?
I think possibly you know the one that it is the reclining figure that looks almost like it's in a landscape. And people say, it looks like cushions or something, but actually, eh, forget
Mm.
the realism or putting a tag on it. It is actually a figure, but it is in a series of sort of like a landscape of shapes. Um, Funny enough, that also that
Mm.
piece has to be looked down on. So you often see sculpture which is on a pedestal, or you look up, look at or look round. He was very adamant that you should look down on his work and that it should come out of a surrounding that is totally anonymous, that it hasn't got a definite edge. It should almost sort of float into nothing, and that the actual sculpture would emerge from from the outside edge. In fact, somebody saw one yesterday who's an archaeologist, and she's been working on bog people in Cumbria, and she said, do you know, this really reminds me of, I've just been looking at the bog people, just where the head just
Mm.
sort of emerges out of the surroundings.
Mm.
And I knew what she meant. Obviously it isn't that, and that's not where Roy got the ideas from, but it does get that feeling that these are emerging figures out of something, and emerging back into something.
Quite often, sculptors, artists, but I think sculptures particularly, this is relevant for, they face challenges in their careers. The reason that I say particularly sculptors is because it's so expensive to cast. I know even more so maybe now than it used to be, but it's always been expensive. Was there challenges, do you think, in Roy's career?
Well, yeah, of course there are. Always the obvious challenge. How can you keep a family? It's all those kind of obvious challenges. I think casting is an issue because when you see his work in bronze, it is
Mm.
so how he saw it. So clearly he had bronze in his mind simply because of the quality of the surface. So, with the quality of the surface in plaster is beautiful, actually, because it's so soft and it catches
Mm.
it does the light. It's this light business. But something in bronze, every single um finger mark, every
Mm.
single sort of touch, it shows, where it doesn't show in plaster. It really shows, and you see things. Until you see it in bronze, you don't really understand what you've done, I think. And
Mm.
then when he started to see, so that's a challenge. Again, exactly what you're saying. So there were moments where he had a commission, and a really good commission, which was a portrait, and then immediately the thing that he did with the money would be to try and get his work cast. And we were very, I mean, we're very lucky in with the a big reclining figure. We got some grant from the Henry Moore Foundation, which pushed, a couple of figures into bronze, which was really good.
It is the financial challenge. I've more than one sculptor that I have in mind at the moment. It's limiting their career, this huge expense that they're having to and how much debt they're getting into because it becomes a point
Yes,
where you have to, because you're a creative, you just want to keep producing, but actually it's limiting you because you don't want to sink completely and sink your family as along with it.
yes, it's a real issue, as we
Mm.
know, bronze is very expensive, and if you're thinking in bronze, um, fiberglass and resin or fake bronze does not do their thing at all.
One of the things I was wondering was how Roy felt about the reception of his work. Did he have any opinion on that or not?
Do you know, he was a bit of a chameleon because a lot of people didn't know he was a sculptor. So he's not going to, in public, he's very kind of reticent
Mhm.
about saying, I am an artist. Um, because I think he probably felt that people
Yeah,
wouldn't understand or hadn't got a language in which he could talk. It's very difficult.
yeah.
He's trying to develop a language which is understandable by other sculptors, but maybe not understandable by everybody, because it is a language, and it's a language of shapes, and it's a language of light, and it's a language of,
Mm.
it's got all kinds of facets. You can have a literal interpretation or a thing, but when it's just pure shape,
But he was trailblazing really.
yeah, yeah. Well, talking about language, that's what he will say. I'm trying to develop a language. I'm trying to think in a language. Um, and that gets a bit philosophical, and so it's you probably feel a bit embarrassed talking to your mate about this language.
Mm.
So I think he keeps it a bit secret, and he's working it out all the time. Does it work? And it's very nerve-wracking. Is this one going to work?
Mm.
Because each one is quite different. Is this going to work, or is it going to think? So he did work in a series which tells you how, it tells me anyway, how he started, often much more realistically. So there's recognizable feet or whatever, and then gradually it's moving until it becomes really just a language of shapes. And it doesn't matter that is it a figure or is it a bit of drapery or thing. It's based on something that he can sort of base this language on.
Did he exhibit in his lifetime?
He had an exhibition at the old Jeffrey Archer Gallery, which was a bit of a disaster because for various reasons he put all his work up, and it was suddenly his work disappeared and paintings were put up. He had a really successful exhibition at the October Gallery. I can't date it, but I remember it. And we put up a big wall, so
Mm.
all the ones of swimmers went up. Um, and again, interest, um, support, but no
Yeah,
commissions coming from his own work. So again, we're still uh, getting a commission, um, surprisingly, for the House of
mm,
Commons for a portrait. So now he's and then people were saying, "Oh, Roy, it's Roy doing a portrait. That's extraordinary." But so he did the portrait of
mm.
Anthony Eden, Lord Avon, for the House of Commons and one for the Foreign Office, um, because his work had been seen in the National Portrait Gallery. So it's almost like there's a different route, sort of threading through, and then
Yeah.
funding that would fund a piece of sculpture, so that would fund a bronze. So that's like a sort of route in and out of portraiture.
And so you've brought all his works together at the moment, Biddy, and I just wanted you to tell everyone a little bit about the exhibition that you have on there and where
Yeah,
it is.
right. So we brought this exhibition together because it was the first time for over 20 years that there had been no exhibition of Roy's work. And the whole family thought it was time to review kind of where he stood in terms of British sculpture. I mean, that sounds very grand, but you do review things and think, how important is this sculpture? And sometimes you can't see that unless you have it on an exhibition. You have to put it out there and you sort of remove yourself once you try and put the work in a space or in a situation where you can see it. I mean, see it is understand how it relates to other people's work, how it relates to drawing, and how it relates to what else is going on around you. And so we made an exhibition not of all the early work, which is now is non-existent, because of course a lot of the plaster work disintegrated, but of the main bronzes and of the main panels, which are in relief, and put them in one place and have a really good look at them and really think, is this what the value of this work is? And so we put it together in two places. One was where he worked, which was up in the moors. And the second place is on the space where I am now, which is on the King Street workshops in Pateley Bridge. The workshops are a set of working artists and craftspeople working together on a site in an old museum. And in this space, there's a glass blower, there's another sculptor, there is a jeweler, a ceramicist, a textile worker, and somebody who's working in mosaics. So there's all these artists are working on one site, which makes it a very self-supportive sort of atmosphere that people can help each other with all kinds of things. And this space here is an education space where drawing, painting is taught, where well, all kinds of crafts are taught, but it can turn itself into an exhibition space. So number 6 Studio Gallery, as it sounds like, is at Pateley Bridge at the old workhouse. And the exhibition will now be on till the 9th of June, so we're nearly at the end, the last weekend, but it's been very successful in terms of numbers of people who've walked through the door, because the whole site is having a 30 years celebration of working here. So we're all using each other's, well, basically using each other's names to advertise it.
Sure.
So it would be lovely if people came and really talked and asked questions, because I think that's, unless people aren't asked questions, we can't really answer give anybody any answers that they might want to know. How things are made, why were they made, what's the point of them, what's the point of sculpture, why is it so different to painting? All these questions come up with people walking through the door. So it is not a selling exhibition, it is a looking exhibition. So there's nothing here to sell, in terms of there's nothing here that you could immediately take off the wall and buy. Because although there are some drawings, the drawings relate very closely to the works that are on the wall, that are the sculptures, and therefore they almost belong to the sculptures at the moment, until we may be able to make a decision about what's going to happen, what's the next stage for this collection of work.
And so if people miss this exhibition,
Yeah, although if people want to see it, they are more than welcome. It will be back in his studio in a sort of exhibition space, or set up like an exhibition. But now his studio is not a working studio so much as an exhibition, a showing studio. And people are more than welcome. and I will give anybody who asks, I can give them my email address, and it's by invitation. They're more than welcome to come and look and spend the afternoon looking. It's a beautiful space.
Tell people, Biddy, where you're based, where this studio is based.
The studio is based um, in just outside Pateley Bridge, North Yorkshire, and it is based quite near to the big sculpture called the Coldstones Cut, which is a sculpture by Andrew Sabin, sculptor, which is a monumental piece of work over a quarry. So where you can walk up, but you sort of almost down the road. Difficult to explain because it's sort of in the moors. It's right
Perfect.
up on the moors, and you have to find it. Yeah.
The most beautiful place. Tell me just, to sort of round up the interview, um, what would you like to see happen for Roy's work next? Have you any thoughts about that?
This is almost the most difficult question that I've been asking myself is what do we do with a collection of work that we feel and I feel is important in terms of where this artist sits in the sort of the history of sculpture of his period.
Mm,
So that's of working as a as a carver and then a modeler. So it's working with clay, so working in a traditional manner, but trying to find a philosophy through quite a traditional way of working in the sense that it's clay, plaster, and bronze. Um, so trying to find that his own language, how important is that? Should it be kept as a collection, which makes a lot of sense in terms of looking at it, because you can see the relationship between one piece and another piece, and you can see how one piece grows into the next piece. So, like a sort of education sort of thing, or do we? Well, that's the one question. That would probably be my first preference. How to do that, of course, is amazingly difficult. I mean, there are ways, but that's what our thinking is at the moment. Other than that, we all know that this is now he's not here anymore, so it's not public sculpture. It can't be put in the public domain, i.e., put outside or offered to somewhere. Would you like this piece of sculpture? It takes it out of its context, which I think is the whole. That's not it. I don't think that art galleries where it could work, that their art galleries are so full of work, and the having to look after another piece of work is really a problem. You know, it's almost like lumbering an art gallery with a problem even to offer it to them,
mm,
because they've got to maintain it, they've got to store it, they've got to show it, you know, occasionally if it fits in. Letting them know that it's available might be a really good idea, because then if somebody wants to use this work as part of an exhibition, that would make a lot of sense. So that's sort of where the thinking is at the moment.
mm. Thank you, Biddy. This has been such fun, so interesting. I'm hoping that you'll just tell people if they'd like to come and see Roy's work, how do they get in touch with you? What's the easiest way?
Yeah, so would you like my email now?
Yes,
We can give
read
you
out your
the
email.
it is Biddy Noakes at btinternet.com. And all they have to do is, and somebody has to do, if they'd like to see it, just email that number. So it's Biddy
Perfect.
Noakes at btinternet.com.
I hope you've enjoyed the interview about Roy Noakes. If you're in North Yorkshire, I do encourage you to visit his studio. Apart from anything else, Biddy and her lovely family are so interesting and intelligent that you're going to have a wonderful day out. And experiencing Roy's work is just another bonus. In a conversation I had with Biddy off air, I did ask her whether or not Roy's success had sort of sidelined her own sculptural ambitions. And she said this wonderful thing. I am not a frustrated artist, she said. I love teaching. I am one of those teachers of art who really enjoyed teaching children. It was my career. Wouldn't we have all loved to have been taught by a teacher like that? Someone who was so dedicated and committed to her subject that she would have definitely inspired people. I know I would have done. I didn't have a great experience at school, even though I came from a background of art with my family. My art teacher just closed me down completely, probably because I didn't seem that good at it. But these things, this is something I teach kids all the time, is that just because the first time you pick up a pencil, you may not feel united with it, does not mean you don't have a creative mind or an artistic skill, but it needs cultivating. And if you come across people that scorn you at an early age, I think it makes you very wary of the subject. And I champion people like Biddy who do it the right way. Coming up later in the season, I have an interview with Richard Calvo-Caresi, formerly director of the Henry Moore Foundation. And I'm going to be talking to him about how a sculptor goes from being professional to the kind of legendary status that Moore has. And I'm really keen to dive into this subject, although Richard is such an interesting man who's done so many different things in his art career that I actually we could have talked about lots of different things, but we'll start with Moore. Who knows? I might get him back again to talk about other things. Please support the show by picking up a copy of one of my books. I've got plenty to choose from. There's a good spread of fiction, always with art at the heart of the story, and non-fiction if you need guidance on caring for bronze or sculptural conservation. They can all be found online, and also you can order them all from bookshops. Have a good rest of the week, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Thank you for listening today. I hope you've been inspired. You can sign up for our mailing list, find photos and the accompanying blog posts at sculpturevulture.co.uk. If you'd like to connect, you can find me on X at LucyBranch11 or Instagram LucyBranch_antique bronze. This podcast has been brought to you today by antiquebronze.co.uk.